you be happy to start, Artie? Yeah.
Hi, so I'm Arti, a Holsworth Research Fellow, just recently moved into the business school, and my research predominantly focuses on broader like environmental agendas and environmental norms and global governance, and links to sustainable value chains and especially agriculture.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so thank you for organizing the amazing event. And my name is Poliana. I'm a senior lecturer in physical geography. My research is basically using technologies like Earth observation to try to understand how tropical forests are impacted by climate change, and also how this forest can contribute for mitigation in climate. I also work a little bit with diversity and inclusion in science and in the area of Earth observation as well.
So I suppose that we can open up to the room, and hopefully we have possibilities for richness of discussion that cuts across like the fields of expertise that we have available here. Is there anyone who'd like to start? If not, I'm ready to. Oh, sorry, I didn't see a hand behind my screen. My apologies, please.
I just think if you take those three fascinating talks together, that we have this nexus of local solutions not being addressed by a national policy, by technocentric pushes which don't contextualize the realities on the ground, and a lack of legislative oversight that seems to be absolutely a crime against humans. And so it was really interesting to see that discourse evolve from the first to the last presentation. And I guess what I would ask is, like, what did the speakers think of the other talks, and how there is quite a powerful connection at the University of Manchester to maybe like start to build holistic solutions together.
I mean, that was exactly my thought. I mean, when I was thinking about how these work together, it's about deficits in the governance system, isn't it? Like, and it's about power. Like the first talk, I think Yusra gave a really interesting thing. It's almost about thinking about what these different climate crimes are, and what actually gets admitted, and what are the power structures involved in enabling what can actually be heard and what doesn't get heard. And then the talk you gave, Gloria, was then talking about, okay, then who decides the narrative of what the adaptation problem is, right? Because the way you define a problem is a precondition to even how green finance might work, how it inflows into policy, and maybe even the policy of how the African Court of Justice designs its policy based on these definitions. And if these are global north heavy definitions, where is then the voice? And I think then the third presentation you gave, Chris, was in saying, well, then there's a lack of industrial policy here, right? Like, there's a dark side to having something good. Electrification is good, okay? So if you get off-grid solar, great. But then the dark side is there's all this lead contamination. So then what do you do in that case? You can just stop giving electricity because the costs are too high? Or do you have to think of alternative ways in which these governance deficits are then filled?
Well, in my case, it's particularly frustrating because addressing the lead pollution problem isn't costly. In fact, it's profitable. What there is a lack of awareness and a lack of oversight and logistics to connect this economic burden of the lead pollution to the profitable recycling industry. So, yeah, it's a frustrating case on my end. But what I particularly liked about the first presentation, and what I thought was concerning from my case study, is the need for country-level legal action, or for injustices to be recognised by local governments before going to an African court, because I can see there will be lots of potential hindrances along that path that might stop these maybe individual accounts or anecdotes representing human injustices to actually stop them from being recognised at an international level.
Would you like to come in on that point, Yusra? Or yeah. 1 second. I'll just unmute you. My apologies.
I'd love to meet you all here.
Thanks. So I completely agree with that. I think that in the context of these climate cases, there's been a lot of emphasis on the obstacle of, oh, it's going to be very slow, it's a climate emergency, we need to act faster. But even if we just remove that entirely, there's still so many other problems that can come up, as has been accurately said. This requirement to exhaust domestic remedies is particularly difficult when you apply it in the African context, and that might explain why we don't actually have a lot of environmental, not even talking about climate, but just any environmental cases that come up, even though there's so much potential, because the African Charter actually is one of the rare international treaties that actually enshrines the right to a healthy environment. And so, problems to do with legal representation, costs, the judicial systems in different countries and how they operate. And so, that definitely hinders the prospects for a regional court to kind of take over and make broad statements. But there have been some attempts in certain countries over the recent years, so I am still hopeful. There have been judgments that have been rendered in South Africa, in Nigeria, Ghana, to my knowledge, and Kenya, right? And those countries have also advanced legislation recently, so they have different acts or laws that have come out about climate. So it's a slow movement, but I think from the legal perspective, I'm optimistic.
I might have used my privilege as chair to take the next question, if that's okay. Sorry, I was just explaining that I'm going to abuse my position as chair to take the next question. So one theme that came out of all the papers, and one theme that I think is obviously very topical, is the theme of vulnerability. So all speakers mentioned vulnerability in their talks. And I perhaps wonder if this idea of revisiting climate vulnerability could be a common thread that could group together these researchers, let's say they were to pursue like a joint endeavour after this panel. And therefore I invite the panel to maybe speak upon what vulnerability means to them, because obviously it's a very notoriously tricky and disputed concept, which has many different meanings across many different fields. And over environmental hazards, it has a distinct meaning. In different areas, it has a distinct meaning as well. So I suppose that was one point. And then relatedly, and linking I think to the discussion we just had, this idea of the fact that we have a failure of the state, almost a failure of governance, and therefore that's leading to these grassroots responses. And I suppose then the question is, we've just discussed with Yusra's response the potential for the international standards to filter down into legislation, but I'd like to invite you to reflect on how these grassroots responses might filter upwards into legislation and therefore into the way rights and international standards are set and defined. The entire panel.
Can I
jump
on that? Yeah, it was exactly what I was reflecting when I saw the presentations. All of the three presentations, for example, they're mention about the vulnerability, for example, and not sometimes what I realize in my own research as well, that echoing what exactly, for example, Gloria was mentioning, is like sometimes you have people in the ground, they're more vulnerable, right? For example, I work with forests, so indigenous people in the forest, they know what's going on. They have kind of strategies in their own way how to deal with the problems, you mentioned about, Gloria, at the end of your presentation, about some organizations, the community. So the community has the communities have a very good and important voice to be heard. So I think one of the main problems that we face to make the justice happen is not hear properly and not give space to these people being heard. In general, it's like from the top to the bottom. The decisions are made in that level without here this level. And then we end up with a kind of trajectory of commons, right? Because they're not being heard, there is no communication. So my reflection here is also how we as researchers can make sure that our responsibility in this middle happen, this communication happen between the community and the governance for be effective really. Yeah, what's the opinion of you guys in this respect?
If I can jump in, I think going back a little bit to my presentation, that it's an issue about how we frame and how we understand, how we frame the problem, right? For example, in the community that I work in Los Cabos, it was really interesting to see people going through. So it was supposed to be surveys, but it turned to be like a semi-structured or a structured interview. And these are hard-working communities, working class, who, when I asked what's the biggest barrier for you to engage more in climate action, they would say, I don't have the time. It's just, I'm so worried about the climate, but I don't have the time, or I have other priorities. I have to work, and when I don't work, I'm thinking about other work that I can go into. And when I'm not doing that, I'm just sleeping or taking care of my kids. And so these people that didn't have time took time with me to be there for an hour and a half. So they want to be heard, first of all. And it was interesting hearing them and listening to their process. For example, talking about water. Some people would say, oh no, I'm a big water waster. Honestly, I have to be honest with you, I just waste so much water. And I would say, okay, so my question was, how do you save water? And they would answer, I waste water. I could have stopped at there. And I would say, okay, so what do you mean by wasting water? Can you give me an example? And they would say, well, I water my plants daily. Or, there is a lot of, because of other things, there's a lot of cows walking through this. It's an urban community completely in the middle of a place where there's a lot of resorts, hotel resorts in the sides, but there are a lot of cows that just roam freely and eat everywhere. And so when the cows come, I wash my sidewalk. When it's too hot, I shower twice a day. I wash my clothes. And I would say, so do you wash a shirt? Or no, I wash a full cycle, but I wash a lot. So this is not waste. And I would say like, oh, that's interesting. And I would give them examples about waste. Do you X and Y? They would say, no, not at all. And I would just wait there in silence. And then they would say, you know what? I actually don't waste water. I actually just use water when I have it. But these are communities that have water once a month for a couple of hours. So having water once a month and then using it to water your plants, but this is an adaptive strategy as well because it helps them with heat, it's shade, it helps the community, right? So how we frame the problem is really, really, I think, important. In our approach to research, to understanding where they're coming from, to, again, echoing what I said in my presentation about looking at the context where these things emerge and looking at this maybe at least from the start in our research, not as the informal or the formal, but about what are the responses and making sense of that responses in the local setting to understand how to develop. And I think in terms of policy, for me, it's just, people are doing what is right. So if we could finance those actions, for example, in the local settings, reparative justice is really, really important, and redistribution as well.
Thank you. anyone else in the panel or yourself, you sort of want to jump in on that point? Yeah, I can see your hand raised. Sorry, with your blurred black background, the hand was taken away. I'm just going to mute myself and I'll mute you. I'll give you a thumbs up. Already.
Thanks. Yeah, these are some really great questions that you've raised about vulnerability. I think that from the judicial perspective, a reason why it's so important or interesting for the case law to develop and for more climate cases to come up is to be able to clarify what vulnerability actually means in the law. Because we understand what being a victim is in human rights, so that's pretty clear. You have to have already suffered some kind of a harm. But what's a bit more delicate in the climate context is that a lot of cases come up whereby the harm hasn't necessarily already been suffered, but there's a risk of. And that is essentially at the heart of vulnerability. It's being exposed to the possibility of being harmed, right? That makes you vulnerable. And I feel the jurisprudence hasn't really gotten there yet. So there are some cases, the Human Rights Committee has said in a case, which was the Tatiota case versus New Zealand in 2020, it was before a UN human rights body, and they said, okay, victims have to have been actually affected, and it has to be more than a theoretical possibility, so we know that much, but we don't actually have enough in the case law to understand what vulnerability is, and that's critical to future climate cases that will come up. So that's something that I think really needs clarification, and that's why. And then coming to the second point that you raised, Luke, about the grassroots movements and the impact that they can have internationally. So this is exactly a reason why such cases have been coming up before international and regional courts, which I find fantastic. And in the African context, I have actually recently been in touch with a group of civil society representatives, and they are in the course of preparing a request for an advisory opinion before the African Court on Human People's Rights. So I know it's like on the way and it's happening, and we've been having discussions about it. And so I think there is a widespread belief that these movements can go upwards, and that can essentially be, that's almost the, I would say, I think a lot of people believe that that's probably their last recourse because governments have failed them. And so all they have left is, the international or regional kind of judges who can tap countries on the fingers and be like, you should be doing better, essentially.
Thank you so much, Yusra. It is 10:30 now, and I appreciate that there's so much more rich discussion we could be having. I suggest that we bring the panel to a close, and perhaps people can enjoy individual discussions over coffee and so forth, and obviously contact details will be available. Obviously everyone on the panel has a Manchester link, so Manchester email address. So if I could ask everybody in just showing our appreciation to our panel and today's speakers.